Hello, beautiful community. A couple of big picture remarks that'll touch on the drone attack on Russia by Ukraine, on the bombardment of Kharkiv by Russia, and on the state of the war and the Kursk incursion. I won't give a health update in this chat, beautiful community, but I will share, health allowing, a video on my Vlad's ME diary channel, maybe tomorrow. I'm trending in a negative direction physically at the moment, and that means uncertainty despite the verticalization. That means sending love to all of you who are going through any kind of challenge that you're going through. So my love your way. A little bit of analysis now, if that's okay. As long as Ukraine continues to be under-supported, and it will continue to be under-supported by the West at the level of its economic sustenance, political sustenance, at the level of availability to Ukraine of a civically acceptable picture of victory. As long as that under support continues, Ukraine's war on Russian territory will escalate, not just in quantitative terms, but in qualitative terms. That's to say, Kursk won't be the last new thing that we see on Russian territory of the kind that we haven't seen before. That's old reheated cabbage, because we've been talking about this for a long time. But that connected picture is more prescient than ever today. The yet latest bombardment of Kharkiv, and much more importantly the Kursk incursion by Ukraine, have put on the table this issue of the West disinhibiting Ukraine around rules of engagement, the Western weapons on Russian territory. Now, we talked about other political aspirations for Ukraine in the Kursk incursion already. We won't re-legislate on that, whether that be destabilizing Russia, changing the West's perspective that the longer the war goes, the more it'll be advantage to Russia, emotionally mobilizing folks at home, you name it. I just want to focus on one political intent here, and that is changing rules of engagement. Militarily, of course, it remains the case that military experts are uncertain and skeptical of whether the Kursk incursion will prove militarily advantageous or disadvantageous for Ukraine. I'm not going to legislate on that beyond just myself following analyses. But politically, Ukraine has generated some clear, at the very least, clear short-term advantages for it. And this business of rules of engagement is one such advantage. And I think there are two issues around it. And one is an issue around which Ukraine might well get progress in its favor, and the other is one that's less likely to generate progress. And Zelensky knows about the first one and is pushing really hard for it, and that is disinhibition of Ukraine's use of Western weapons on Russian territory. And the historic picture is often that one country makes a change, then another follows, and a third sees this and follows too. So it's sort of piecemeal and rather incremental and rather ill-assorted. But that's the history, and that's how it'll carry on going. But there's genuine possibility for further momentum here for Ukraine. The less likely story is that second story of Russian missiles being intercepted by a willing coalition of Ukraine's neighbor states over Ukrainian territory. That's not impossible, but that's much less plausible than disinhibition around rules of engagement. Now I want to put down a principle before I let you go, beautiful community. That's actually okay for 100% of you, but 4.3% of you have been historically triggered by it. So you might need to sit more comfortably. We've talked about the Russian imperialism at hand here. We've talked about how it's not an imperialism of civilizing another, but rather an imperialism of a story that says that you are an us that's forgotten, you are us. We've talked about how this is a project that in the very long term will not be able to perpetuate itself, beyond Putin's life. We've talked about it not offering anything except threats of violence and violence to its neighboring states. But another concept I've introduced over the couple of years is US support for Ukraine as an example of constructive and benign projection of imperial power. Moreover, I've introduced another element here, and that's the element of a proxy. I have referred to this as a US imperial proxy war that is benign and constructive. Now, it's very important that I recommend this concept of proxy for reasons of actually emphasizing rather than de-emphasizing Ukrainian agency. And it's a real empathy toward Ukraine's experience is very important here. Whether you call the US an empire is actually not a concept where I insist one goes one way or another. It's a matter of sensibility. If you believe in an idea of an empire light, a power in whose capitals the fates of many countries might get decided, you could call it an empire. If you want a richer story about what makes an empire, perhaps you won't. But what's very important to understand is how much agency a proxy can have, that a proxy doesn't have to be a negative term, and how hard it is to be a proxy, because here I'm sitting and my national survival is dependent on decisions that might get made in the capital of a major power, and indeed be a byproduct of the fragility and flailing in domestic politics of that major power. So it's not just that if you're Ukrainian you feel uncertainty about the future, you also feel uncertainty about the keys to your future and where they lie. And being in that dynamic actually requires an enormous amount of agency, because you're always trying to get that major power to do more of what you want it to do and less of what you don't want it to do, right? And so this conversation about Zelensky pressing for rules of engagement is a conversation about Ukrainian agency, right? And Ukrainian agency in this dynamic of fragile dependence. So why am I reintroducing this notion at this point? Because I want to say the following thing. Ukraine's agency and our perception of it will get dramatized over the coming months, right? We're going to see more Ukraine doing things that are Ukraine going its own way, right? In different respects, untethering from its Western partners, which it wants to very much keep, in response to two challenges that Ukraine faces. The first challenge is under support in the way we've described it. But the second challenge is the perception that even though it might not be feasible, the momentum in the United States is to try to bring the war to a close. There is a difference between the Trump and the Harris administration. The Harris administration would try to only bring the war to a close if it could do so sustainably and constructively. A Trump administration would be much more open to a destructive cessation of the war. But that's the trajectory, and that's the pressure on both sides. Now, that doesn't mean it's possible, because the Russians might want to stop the war as a way of winning it, and Ukraine may not be able to agree to things that threaten its economic sustenance, threaten its existence, or are civically unacceptable to it. But the potential impossibility of it doesn't stop the momentum from being there. And Ukraine is, the more that momentum becomes palpable, the more Ukraine will be keen to implicate, right, the United States above all, but also European powers, in the perpetuation of the war, rather than in a destructive cessation of the war from Ukraine's point of view. So you see, we're talking about a picture of projection of power, potentially imperial projection of power and proxy that centers not just the enormously challenging predicament Ukraine is in, but actually centers the extraordinarily challenging path for Ukraine's agency. Because Ukraine is not just taking on the Russians, it's taking on its sort of uncertain and fragile backing of support from the West. Enough for today, beautiful community. Do a health update tomorrow, and we'll keep talking. And as soon as I'm able, we might do a longer Q&A, because I just value these so much for depth of community engagement. Lots of love.